This is a review of Chapter 5. You'll want to have your Chapter 5 notes handy because there are a few things you're going to want to add to them, and you're welcome to pause the video at any time if you want to add any kind of examples or supplement them with information. So we're going to be talking about systems in this chapter. And our case study is all about dead zones. Dead zones are areas of the ocean where oxygen has become so depleted that marine organisms either leave or they will die. Hypoxia is a really important word that means low oxygen. We will talk about the cause of these hypoxic zones in just a bit. This chapter focuses on big picture ecology, especially systems. First, we want to talk about feedback loops in nature. The first example is a negative feedback loop, which is the most common in nature. Don't think it's bad just because it's called negative. This system works much like a thermostat. So if things get too hot in your house, your thermostat cools it down. If it gets too cold, it heats it back up. So you're trying to find a happy medium that we would call equilibrium. In this example, we could apply it to a predator and prey model. Much like the moose and the wolf example that you worked with, you can see that the link and the hare relationship will cycle basically together, usually meeting back at some point of equilibrium. A positive feedback loop is more rare in nature, and it's one that's driven to a single direction to an extreme. For example, here we see that climate change can be a great example of a positive feedback loop, but it's usually caused by human interaction. For example, when climate change takes place and results in warmer temperatures, that causes more ice to melt. And as the white ice melts, fewer of the solar rays are going to be reflected. Instead, they're going to be absorbed. And as they melt the ice, the ground cover becomes darker and darker, which in turn speeds up the heating and the melting process. So when we drew our nitrogen and our phosphorus cycle notes, you learn that some of the nitrogen and phosphorus eventually runs off the land into water, and especially when too much fertilizer is applied to lawns or fields, or excess detergents are washed into the water. This causes excess nutrients and to feed the algae or the phytoplankton, and they grow like crazy or bloom. And then when all of those excess algal bodies die, then there's so many of them that the bacteria in the water that decompose them go crazy and they use up all of the oxygen, and it creates a hypoxic dead zone. It could also happen when there's sewage wastewater, or industrial emissions that are running into our rivers, lakes, and into the ocean. Here it is in a diagram. Many of the I states are responsible for the excess fertilizer runoff into the Gulf of Mexico, leading to the huge dead zone we know of. So I states, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, they're some of the worst as far as fertilizer runoff. The rest of this chapter is mostly focused on ecosystems. And we've already learned how energy flows through an ecosystem and how matter moves through an ecosystem because we already studied the biogeochemical cycles. Now we want to focus on biomass and how it moves through an ecosystem. We talk about biomass using measures of gross primary production, or GPP, and net primary production, or NPP. GPP is all of the energy used by autotrophs, while NPP is the energy that is left over and available for primary consumers after respiration. We can compare ecosystems in terms of their biomass productivity. Make sure you add this definition of productivity to your Chapter 5 notes, so it focuses on how we measure productivity in units of energy, per units of area, per units of time, such as the example you see right here on the screen. Here is a graph comparing the NPP of some of the world's ecosystems. You can see that the real hot spots for primary productivity include algal beds, reefs, tropical rainforests, and some of the low spots would be deserts and open ocean because there aren't very many producers in those areas. Add this to your notes. This is a visualization of NPP around the world. And if you remember from biology when you studied photosynthesis, red and blue light are the two colors used the most for photosynthesis by producers. And red light is going to be absorbed by the ones that are most shallow. Blue light will shine deeper into the water, and so the producers that are deeper in the water have adaptations to allow them to absorb the kind of light that reaches them. We've already focused on the cycling of nutrients, but we just need to hit a few points to review them. So once again, nitrogen is the most important limiting factor for plant growth, but it's also one of the most damaging things in the ecosystem when there's too much of it. Here's a satellite image of the largest Gulf dead zone that has been measured so far. It happened in 2017, and it was about the size of New Hampshire. The Gulf of Mexico is just the best known dead zone. There are many others around the world, and they cause a lot of loss of revenue for fisheries and even tourism. Here is an ecosystem vocabulary word that you need to know. It's ecotone, or a transition zone between two ecosystems. We live in an ecotone where the tallgrass prairie butts up against the eastern deciduous forest. If you want to study how ecosystems behave, you might become a landscape ecologist. Here we see a forested area that has been fragmented into patches. This is a really important part of conservation biology, figuring out what's going on in the ecosystem by looking at the patterns in the landscape and making management decisions based on those patterns. Habitat corridors are one way that we can link up isolated patches that are kind of like islands in the ecosystem. Here you can see one that's being created to allow wildlife to cross an area that's been fragmented by a highway. One of the tools that landscape ecologists use to look at the land patterns is remote sensing, which may be using satellite imagery that's been digitized into smart map programs called Geographic Information Systems, or GIS programs. I worked as an environmental consultant before becoming a teacher, and I was a GIS specialist. This tool was the main tool that we used for helping developers and conservationists make decisions about the land. GIS is just one way we can model what is happening in an ecosystem. If you really like computers, math, and environmental science, ecological modeling might be a good fit for you. Modeling lets us apply the scientific method even when we cannot manipulate our experiment because it's an entire ecosystem. Now we want to talk about ecosystem services, which are goods and services provided by healthy, functioning ecosystems, and they include all these things that you see on the slide. So this little diagram shows us just some of the examples of ecosystem services in a typical ecosystem. And this is where you need to pause the video and copy this diagram into your notes, because we need to actually know a little bit more about ecosystem services than our textbook provides us. So there are actually 4 categories of ecosystem services to know. Provisioning services are ecosystem services that describe the materials or energy outputs from ecosystems, and they would include food production, water, cutting down trees and using their wood and fiber, or extracting fuel from the earth. Supporting services underpin almost all other services. Ecosystems provide living spaces for plants or animals. They also provide or maintain a diversity of different breeds of plants and animals. So that would include those large-scale processes like nutrient cycling, soil formation, primary production, and habitat provisioning. So none of these others could exist without them. Next, we have regulating services, which are services that ecosystems provide by acting as regulators. So those would include the climate regulation, flood regulation, such as wetlands acting as a barrier to prevent flooding, and water purification, such as when water trickles down, percolates through the soil into groundwater and is purified. The last one is cultural services, which include non-material benefits that people obtain from contact with ecosystems. And they would include spiritual, aesthetic, educational, and recreational. So being able to go hiking at Clinton Lake, the forest is providing us a cultural service. I want to make sure that you knew a few terms that we talk about when we talk about biogeochemical cycles that may not have been mentioned in the notes. And they include the terms you see here, pools or reservoirs, which is just talking about a place where those nutrients may reside. For example, rocks would be a reservoir for phosphorus. Flux describes the rate at which the materials move around in the ecosystem. And then two more really important terms that can be applied to all of the biogeochemical cycles, sink and source. So a sink is typically a reservoir that's growing over time, and a source is a reservoir that's decreasing over time. For example, in this carbon cycle diagram, the creation of fossil fuels would be a carbon sink, and the burning of fossil fuels would be a carbon source. For just a quick review, let's talk about how humans impact the water cycle. So we do this by removing vegetation, using water for irrigation, damming rivers, adding pollutants, and overusing groundwater. What are the human impacts on the carbon cycle? We do this by extracting and burning fossil fuels, cutting down trees. Trees are a great reservoir of carbon, and there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere right now than there has been for 800,000 years. Let's talk about how humans impact the nitrogen cycle. We do this by creating synthetic fertilizers using the Haber-Bosch method, and then over-applying it, overusing it, which in turn leads to eutrophication, an increase in greenhouse gases, and even increase in smog. This graph shows the increasing impact of synthetic fertilizers since they were invented upon our ecosystems. And finally, the phosphorus cycle. How do humans impact it? When we extract phosphorus, it ends up in the water eventually, which contributes to eutrophication. And that comes not only from fertilizer runoff, but also from cleaning products that are made with phosphates. What can we do about dead zones? Well, there has been some helpful legislation to help regulate them and to find solutions such as reducing fertilizer use or using smarter application of fertilizer, improving sewage treatment, improving wetlands because wetlands can be restored to act as sponges to absorb those excess nutrients before they enter the waterways. And we can just decrease pollution through using fewer of those synthetic fertilizers. Cover crops are another great solution, especially legumes, because they not only protect the soil from erosion, they will also help with natural nitrogen fixation, meaning you'd have to use fewer synthetic fertilizers. So that's a wrap on ecosystems and how we study ecology at a larger scale.